Hey, Dave Van.
Hello. Hi, Sean.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
Doing all right, doing all right. How was your break?
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, welcome back.
Thanks. Hey, Yoav. Hey, Mark. Mark, did you want to talk about the V2 APIs today?
Yeah, sure. I do have something prepared.
All right, let me add a bullet for that. What's a good name for it? Protobuf APIs
Version,
V2?
or I'm just going to pitch it as version 2 chain code APIs. Well, for Go anyway.
And specifically, it's the Protobuf V2, right?
Yeah, that's the big change really for the version 2. Stealing all the news from my presentation there.
Oh, I was hoping there'd be a little bit more, but
A little bit more, a little bit.
Okay, so we've got Sean from Linux Foundation on. He's going to talk about the new project charters across the Hyperledger projects. But I'll first do a quick release update. But did anybody else have anything else for the agenda? Can you see the screen?
Yeah, I can see the screen. Looking good.
Okay. Uh, so real quick, so as most people know, we've been working on a V3 release for Fabric. The major feature there is the SmartBFT consensus for the ordering service. That work is all done. We just have a few odds and ends to finish out now, one being the removal of the V1 chain code lifecycle. In the previous meeting, I had some more detailed notes about what that entails. I've had a little bit of discussion with Artem on that. He says he's still making progress on that. So that's good. But I think everything else for V3 is looking pretty good. We've got the beta out. I haven't heard any big problems or anything like that with the beta. So I think as soon as we get that lifecycle removal stuff in, then we would go ahead and release that V3 for Fabric. In the meantime, we're still doing the minor patch releases for Fabric 2.5 and Fabric CA 1.5. So that's kind of business as usual. Nothing much to mention here for those. Anybody else have any other questions or comments about the releases? Okay, I will hand it over to Sean next then to talk about the project charters. Did you want to share the screen, Sean?
Actually, let me see 1 second. I really don't need to share the screen. I can do this verbally, but you know what? Let me move this over to another workspace.
Or I could bring up the Google Doc if you want me to.
Actually, let me bring up the Google Doc
Okay,
and
yeah.
I can keep this quick. Sorry. I have workspaces moving around, so there we go. Can you all see my screen? All right, great. So on July 8th, David Boswell, who's the Senior Director of Community Community at Hyperledger, reached out on the Fabric mailing list. I'm not going to give you a dramatic reading of this, but basically we are working with the different projects within Hyperledger, and this is a cross Linux Foundation effort. So it's not just Hyperledger. I'm doing this for the Open Wallet Foundation right now. We have 16 projects at OWF. And some of them have moved from Hyperledger to Open Wallet Foundation. Some have contributed directly to Open Wallet Foundation. And basically, the goal of this is to get project charters in place to make governance more clear, to create better guidelines, to be more transparent with both the existing community and maintainers that we have for any one of our projects, but also for new folks. If someone's coming here from another company or someone's really interested in working on a project, we want to be as transparent as possible about the quote unquote how things work. The overall process, and this is on a project by project basis, so I'll give you a couple of examples. Fabric has a lot of sub projects, as does Indy and Aries, and the charter for Fabric would apply to the sub projects of Fabric. The charter for Indy would apply to the sub projects of Hyperledger Indy. In the case of Aries, because one or two of those Aries projects are considering moving over to OWF, it would be for all of the Aries sub projects until some time as they moved over to OWF, and then we would just give them an updated charter. But the overall goal of this is to make sure that we have feedback and agreement from the maintainers of a given project. We're able to bring that back inside the Linux Foundation, make any updates or edits to the charter, and then bring it back to the maintainers, as this is the charter for Fabric. I do want to make one point. Mark Lewis, thank you for being on the call. You did ask a great question, and David Boswell, my boss, thought he'd replied to this on groups.io, and evidently it didn't come through, which is why I'm glad I'm here today. But it does include the repos underneath Fabric. Now, there's an asterisk to that. There are a number of labs that Fabric Operations Console, which is something that I'm working on another project called OpenIDL. I have to go back to the project formation team at the Linux Foundation to find out, do labs fall underneath a established project? In my head, I don't know. I don't think they do, but I'm going to get a ruling from the LF project formation team on specifically that. And talking about the overall process, we've drafted a technical charter for Fabric. We have sent this out. We have a number of great questions in here, and we've been making changes based on some of those questions. So going from committers to maintainers. Again, this is a draft. So what works, the context and the vocabulary of Hyperledger is not going to be the context and the vocabulary of CNCF or another project within the Linux Foundation. So we're making these adjustments. We do have questions like Yakov's, so the TFC can modify maintainer membership, and we're checking that out internally because there are other governance documents that govern projects like Hyperledger that are within the technical oversight committee. And so we're making sure that these are all referenced, and this document is normalized across the other governance documents that exist within Hyperledger and Fabric itself. So yeah, it's meant to be as straightforward as possible, and we really do appreciate all the folks who put in comments so far, Mark and Yakov primarily. We've made a bunch of changes and edits. Committers become maintainers throughout the document to make it more clear. Maintainers is the term we use. And yeah, does anybody have any questions for me? As I check to make sure I'm not muted. All right, no, I'm not muted.
So kind of following on to Mark's comments. So there would be a single TSC for the overall Hyperledger Fabric project. Is that true?
So in the new world, as the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, which was just launched, settles and expands, the Fabric would have its own TSC. Yeah, that is the intent. And then the overall organization of Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, I believe, would have its own TOC as well.
Okay, and so it's not like one TSC per repository that we have. We have a single TSC for Fabric that kind of governs all the repositories.
Yes,
Um,
that is my understanding, correct?
and it would be initially made of the core Fabric repository maintainers. Is that true?
That is my understanding, yes.
Okay. So I think there's probably some language we can add here to make that more clear, but
Mhm.
I can go through it and mark the spots where I think we need to say that.
Yeah. And again, if we can get, I know Hyperledger / Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust would like to get the charters finalized and settled and done by August 15th, by mid-August. If y'all could get back to us with any and all questions, comments, put them here in the doc, like that would, between now and the end of July, that would be tremendous and appreciated.
Will do. Yep.
So Dave, I know you asked a member of the community architects team to join the call today. Were there any other questions that you had or like context needed for the process and the why? Would that help?
I guess maybe if you could say a little bit more about the motivation and the switch to the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. That's probably new news to some of the people here.
Oh, okay.
Can you talk a little bit about how that will work relative to what we formerly known as Hyperledger? Should we just think of it as kind of a name change for now, or how should we think about it?
Gosh. Thanks for the easy question, Dave. No, I'm busting your chops. I want to be sensitive about this because really Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust is less of a rebrand of Hyperledger, and it is an expansion of the mission and the organizations that are going to be involved within Hyperledger. It's going to be adding some new projects. It is going to be, in the case of Aries, there are some Aries sub-projects which are considering going to the Open Wallet Foundation. There is a deck which I can look for and pull up. And Jim, I see your hand raised. I'll get to you in 1 second. There is a deck which I can look for and pull up, which gives some of the goals and objectives of LFDT. I just don't want to do
Yeah,
it
maybe
wrong.
as you're talking, if you could pull up that link, I think in David Boswell's email that you showed us a few minutes ago, I think there was a link to the announcement.
Oh, hang on.
Maybe that would at least,
I got
if you
it.
could pull that up so people know about that.
Yeah, let me share this link in Zoom chat. And while I'm doing that, Jim Mason, you had a question.
Yeah, so the rebranding, wherever the concept came from of LF Decentralized Trust, LFDT, wherever that came from, I'm not sure who initiated it, how it came to be, and sort of, I guess the whole process for that was never, at least to me, visible. So it was certainly going on. It wasn't necessarily at all hidden. It just wasn't somehow visible as a process to come up with that. The interesting thing is 2 years ago, I mean, going way back, if you look at Hyperledger, it was all focused around, I'll call it DLT, decentralized ledger technologies, and anything related to that, right? So we had lots of projects in sort of that fold. But 2 years ago, as an architect, we were looking at this stuff and said, well, wait a second, the things that, in a sense, Hyperledger is covering are a subsection of trust. We looked over at security and said that's another subsection of trust. We looked at a bunch of other areas and said there's subsections of trust. So the larger thing was trust in itself, not decentralized trust, just trust. So, from our point of view, we looked at everything globally and just said the whole issue is a problem of trust, not decentralized trust, just trust. So how did they come up with the idea that a subset of trust as decentralized trust is the right boundary to put on this thing? Because if we say that, in a sense, I'll call it Hyperledger as just DLT, within Linux Foundation was not the right boundary. Who decided that decentralized trust was the right boundary for this new thing? Because I
So that would
suspect
have been
not. I suspect it's going to wind up going through the same evolution we did with, in a sense, Hyperledger to say, hey, the boundary is too small, let's expand it. So I think you're going to wind up 2 years from now redrawing this boundary again.
I don't see into the future, so I'm not going to say you're wrong. You might be right about the 2-year time frame in there. I know that the intention is to expand the surface area for what specifically Hyperledger projects, but also just the phrase decentralized trust within the Linux Foundation can mean. In our case, it's starting with Hyperledger and Hyperledger projects and with projects within the decentralized technology sphere. And that's why the word decentralized is in the name, Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. It's not just identity projects, and that identity is the world I come from. So I'm a little sensitive about, it's not all about identity. It's about a lot of the systems that we build and a lot of the communities that we host, and really setting them up for success, but also having a bigger footprint that we can use to both drive members to technologies, to create opportunities for developers to find projects to work on, etc.
Yeah.
And
I
then
just
the
find
thing in
it to
the
be a
second
strange
paragraph
thing.
there is like there's going to be new technologies and communities and specs that are going to start merging into this over time. So Jim, you just said something I talked over you. I'm sorry.
Well, sorry, but the only thing I'm going to say is that the notion of stamping this thing, decentralized trust, to me is a problem. Because what you're saying is, I've created another box slightly bigger than the DLT box, this slightly larger box, now is another place where we quote stuff things in we think that belong in the box. And I'm arguing as a real engineer, when you look at stuff, no, the box is much larger. When you're engineering anything, you're going end to end on what I call trust engineering, period.
Sure.
And it covers everything. It's not just security. It's not just Hyperledger. It's not just, decentralized trust. It's, not just simple things like identity, authentication, its credentials, its consents, its approvals. There's a million things that go into what I call the trust folder, trusted environments, all kinds of stuff. And to have said the first box was too small, okay, fine, I buy that. But to have come up with a second box that's only slightly larger sort of doesn't make any sense to me, that's all.
I totally respect that comment. I will point out, to answer your second or third question there, this was worked out by senior staff at Hyperledger, as well as the Hyperledger board were involved in this. I wouldn't say expansion of the mission, but definitely expansion of the surface area.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Appreciate the insight, though. Thank you.
No worries. And Dave, I want extra points for not crying when Jim said, simple things like identity. So I'm kidding.
Yeah. Does anybody else have questions for Sean? All right, Sean, I think you survived relatively unscathed.
No worries. I was happy to join y'all. I'm going to put some links in the chat, and I will drop these into the Fabric channel on Discord. But yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, thank you. So yeah, I'll definitely take a look at that document and send any recommended updates. And if others could do as well, that would be good. All right, so let's get back to the agenda. We had just finished talking about the release update, but I do see Yoav joined, so I'll at least ask Yoav if there's anything else he wants to mention about SmartBFT and the progress with that.
No, basically we finished doing everything we planned. And as far as we're concerned, for BFT, we're good to go.
Okay, all right. So my earlier statement stands that I think the only thing left is this finishing out the lifecycle removal, and we'll get with Artem to finish that out and then proceed on to our V3 release. Okay, so let's go next to Mark. Mark can talk about the Protobuf V2 APIs that he's been working on related to chain code specifically. So go ahead, Mark. Do you have anything to share? Yep.
Yeah, hopefully you're seeing it.
Yes.
So there we go. Version 2 Go chain code APIs. It sounds very grand. I think one of the main messages will be that it's not actually a huge change, and really the version 2 was kind of forced on us because there are some breaking changes, but I will talk about all of that in a moment. Whoops. Did I go too far? Yeah, there we go. So what were we trying to achieve with these changes? There was a new version released by Google of the Go APIs for protocol buffers. And we say new, actually it's 4 years ago they were released. So when Go version 1.14 was the current Go release. And Fabric continues to use the old protocol buffer API, but that's not necessarily a problem. So that API is still supported and is free to be used, but it is marked as deprecated. So certainly for some people, that was viewed as a problem because they didn't want their application code to be using deprecated APIs. So there's been a drive for some time to migrate towards the newer protocol buffer APIs. And as part of that change, we've identified a couple of API elements in the chain code API where we can slightly improve what was there. So and this is kind of forced on us since we're making a effectively breaking change anyway, it's safe to go on and make a few more breaking changes along with the version number change. Most of the points in the API that use protocol buffer messages pass them as pointers. There were a handful of functions where they were not passed as pointers. They were passed by value. And particularly once we've moved to the version 2 protocol buffer API, that started to become more of a problem because protocol buffer messages are specifically flagged up as being not to be passed by value. I think in reality, this was always the case. They weren't intended to be passed by value, but it was never flagged up explicitly in the language semantics, whereas now it is. So why is it version 2? Well, I've already kind of answered that. It's because some of the changes are breaking changes. So we've been forced to impose a version 2 numbering system on it because Go's very strict about not delivering any breaking API changes in a major version number. There are 2 APIs that are affected. So there's the Fabric chain code, Fabric contract API, and the Fabric chain code Go API. Most of the changes have happened down in that lower level API, the chain code Go, which is the one that has the direct dependency on the protocol buffers. And then because the high level API is depending on that new version of the low level API, the high level API, the contract API, which most people should be using, is also bumped to version 2. The big change, mentioned the protocol buffer change. There are 2 versions of the Fabric protocol buffer bindings published. They're both produced from the Fabric Protos repository, which defines the protocol buffer message structure. The Go bindings based on the old version 1 Protobuf API is published as Fabric Protos Go, and the ones generated based on the new protocol buffers APIs are Fabric Protos Go API version 2. Which the client SDK has been using for a long time. So we can see, important message, there's wire level compatibility between the 2. So you're free, at this stage at least, to select whichever version better suits your needs. And it doesn't matter which version of Fabric you're using, everything still continues to work exactly as before. It's only at an application level that anything looks at all different. At the wire level, when messages are passed between Fabric peers and chain code containers, what's on the wire is absolutely identical. One final change is, since we were bumping the major version, I've taken the opportunity of removing the shim test package from the Fabric chain code Go, since that was marked as deprecated for a number of years. So since we were putting out a version 2, I've just removed that from the version 2 implementation only. So if you're making use of that with the version 1 chain code API, it's still there. So how do I use it? How does my code look different now that there's a version 2 of the chain code API? Well, to illustrate that, let's look at a simple smart contract implementation. This isn't a complete implementation, but it's essentially the asset transfer basic sample from the Fabric samples repository. So you can see we're importing the Fabric Contract API Go, which is the higher level smart contract API. We've defined a smart contract struct based on that API, and we define some transaction functions. So there's read asset is one of them, and there are a bunch of others that I've omitted just so we can fit on a single slide. And then there's a main function, which is what starts your chain code running. So here it says create a new chain code, and assuming that's all good, it just starts the chain code. And that's it. That's the skeleton of a simple smart contract. So how would that look if we were using the version 2 API? Well, exactly the same. The only thing that's changed is we're using the version 2 of the contract API. So just the import statement changes and everything else remains exactly the same. Now let's look at something a bit more complicated, because it's not always quite as simple as just changing the import line and everything else stays identical. If we're looking at a slightly more complicated example, so this is again asset transfer basic from the Fabric samples repository, but this is chain code as an external service. So our main function is slightly different, and we are making some direct use of some of the code in the lower level Fabric Chain Code Go API. So here again, it creates the smart contract instance as normal, creates the chain code, but rather than just starting the chain code in our main function, we see it creates a chain code server with an appropriate set of properties, and then it starts that server listening on a certain address and with a certain chain code name. So here, the key difference is that we're referencing stuff in the low-level API where most of the changes have actually happened. The high-level API, if you're just using that, that really insulates you from pretty much all the changes. It's only where you're referencing things directly from the low-level API that things can change slightly. So how would this more complicated example look using the version 2 API? Well, actually, in this case, it's pretty much the same. We've just changed the package statements. So the corresponding low-level Fabric Chain Code Go is at version 2 rather than version 1, because we're using the Fabric Contract API Go at version 2. So version 2 high level uses version 2 low level. But again, no code changes, which is good news for everyone. There are a couple of other things that have changed in the low-level API, which, depending on what you're doing in your smart contracts, may mean that your code needs to look slightly different. So if you're invoking another chain code from within your chain code, the response from that invocation is now a pointer to a Protobuf message rather than just passed by value. So that is a small change you would need to make in your code. One of the other obvious changes is that in the new protocol buffer API, some of the standard defined types, so in this case timestamp, have now been moved to different packages. So you can see on the left side with version 1, we were importing Golang protobuf ptypes timestamp, and that was the timestamp value that was returned from the getTX timestamp method on the chain code stub, which is passed into your transaction functions. On the right-hand side with version 2, they've moved that, and it's now a different root URL, but also protobuf types known timestamp PB for protobuf. And that's now the return type from the getTX timestamp function. So if you're using getTX timestamp on the chain code stub, there will be a change to the return type on your function. But that's pretty much the extent of the change from an end user perspective. What if we're working with the low-level API directly, rather than using the contract API on top, which isolates you from most of the change? Well, first thing I'd say is don't do that. Prefer to use the contract API. It was designed just so that you could focus more on the business logic of your smart contract and spend less time dealing with the implementation details underneath it. But having said that, what's different? So this pretty much, I think, encapsulates all of the changes that you'll see. So if you're working with the low-level API, instead of implementing a contract object, you're implementing a chain code interface. And the two functions you're dealing with there are init and invoke. And similar to the other changes we looked at, they're no longer returning a response message by value. They're returning a pointer to a protocol buffer response message. So your function signature will need to change, but those response messages look exactly as they did before. One other element is the success and error functions, which you typically use to create that response that you're going to return from init and invoke. But since their return values have changed in sync with the init and invoke return values, probably you're not going to have to make much in the way of change to your code, because what you get back from success is still what you return from your init and invoke functions, and same for error. You don't need to do any translation. The right types are returned. The thing that you will need to change definitely is the function signature for your init and invoke functions to specify the correct return type. And that is all I had. Are there any questions?
Mark, I think you've already updated the Fabric samples repository to use V2. Is that correct?
Yes, that's a really good point. Thanks, Dave, for mentioning that. So there is a pull request that was merged, I guess it was a few weeks ago now, that updates all of the chain code samples, the Go chain code samples from the old V1 API to the newer V2 API. So if you're interested in all the changes that might be necessary in particular scenarios, you can go and dig out that pull request from the Fabric samples repository and just look at what changed. And in most cases, all of the asset transfer samples, the changes are quite minimal, just what I've described here.
Right. So new people starting out with Fabric samples as kind of a baseline, they won't really know anything about, they won't care anything about these differences. They'll just go from the sample probably.
Exactly, yeah.
Yep.
If there's nothing else, I'll sign off.
I had one more. So I know, at least right now, the way it's in the Fabric Chain Code Go repository, it's the V2 is a second directory with a kind of a duplicate implementation of the chain code APIs. And my question is, I think that's fine initially, but my question is, did you consider like using a release branch strategy? So we'd have V1 release branches that continues on with V1 maintenance, and then a V2 branch that would continue on with the V2 maintenance. What would you think about that approach?
That is possible to do, but so you can, when you install a Go package, when you go get a package to add it to your Go mod file, you can specify it by branch names, but that's not a recommended practice, because that just means you're always taking the latest content of that branch, which may be shifting over time. So typically you're looking to consume things by a tag, which in this case, so the contract API is actually tagged as V2.0.0. So it's the typical Go naming semantics, whereas the low-level Fabric Chain Code Go has never been tagged explicitly. So you're using kind of auto-generated pseudo version numbers with that. So if you're using high
so
level,
I guess my corollary question is, do you think we should switch to actually doing typical semantic versioning releases in these repositories?
We're already doing that for the contract API Go. So that has semantic versioning releases, it's tagged releases. So that's already working that way. The low level one, I guess technically it's probably the correct thing to do, but if people are using the high level contract API, you just get whichever version of the low level API it's built on top of. and it doesn't really matter very much.
Yeah, so if we did the semantic versioning for both those repositories, would you change your opinion, and would it then make sense to use release branches with officially tagged releases instead of having two directories within a single repository?
So this is another one that's kind of been mandated by the Go versioning strategy. So quite a while ago, there was a blog post published on the official Go release pages where they discussed how you would version Go releases once you got beyond version 1, which took them a long time to think about. But what they mandated was you should tag it version 2, but you should also put it in a V2 subdirectory. So your whole package path is different. So where you could see those package name changes, if I just hop back to them. So where the V2 has appeared, that's kind of mandated by the Go package versioning strategy. They say that always your version 2 should go in a V2 subdirectory within your
Okay, so
repository structure.
that makes sense, and I agree with that. I guess my question is, what would they say about having a V1 and V2 in the same release branch? Would they be okay with that, or do you think they would prefer to have separate release branches to manage the V1 and the V2 implementations?
I'm not sure what the preference is on that. And kind of my assumption was that because they mandated putting it into a subdirectory, is that it's fine for things to live on in the same branch. But I do see your point that having different branches gives you more flexibility to diverge the content of those two branches. Whether or not you need to, I'm not sure. So you're still free to make changes to the V1 code sitting at the top level, and you're then free to independently make changes to the V2 content sitting within the V2 subdirectory. I'm not sure
Okay, yeah,
whether
I think it's
having
fine
different
for now.
branches buys you a huge
But
amount.
yeah, we'll just keep it in mind if there ever is a change where we think we need to diverge or something, then we could potentially do that. But I think it's fine the way it is for now.
And this is my first time doing a version 2 code stream release in Go. So if other people have done it before and got the scars to say which is the right answer, then I'd be very interested in hearing that.
Yeah, maybe I'll poke around and see what some of the other large projects have done in that regard. Okay, any other questions for Mark? All right, thanks, Mark, for working on this. I know it's been a while since the V1 was deprecated, so it's good to finally get some good support for V2.
Yep, you're welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, any other topics for this week? Okay, I think that's it then. Thanks, everybody. See you next time around.
Thank you.
Okay, see
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
See you.